Welcome and thank you for attending my professional learning session today called Teaching for Diversity, Knowing Yourself and Knowing Your Students. We're going to begin with our plan for the day. So we're going to start with our why. Why are we here? Why did we choose to participate in this session? We're going to then talk about our current context in terms of demographics and in terms of the languages and language levels that our students speak. This will be followed by a short video called From Far Away. Then we're going to go into the 7 areas of self-reflection where we're going to look at some questions and reflect on our answers. Then we're going to look at role reversal and teachers becoming students, putting ourselves kind of in the place or in the shoes of our students and what that might feel like. And then we're going to end the session with some self-assessment and goal setting for the future. We're going to start off today by talking about our why we're here, why we decided to participate in this professional learning session. And so I thought that before I have others share that I would speak a little bit about my why. So I've included this photo of a class that I taught a few years ago now. And I like to look at this photo and reflect a little bit because this class was filled with students who were language learners, who were maybe struggling to get the content in their content level classes. And they were all working really, really hard. But I know that even I, at times, doubted them and doubted their ability to succeed. So looking at this class now, I see someone who's finished 2 years of university. I see someone who's graduated from a program at NBCC and has full-time work. I see a student who's just graduated with an art degree from a really well-known university. I see a student who is an NBC student right now, but also on the side owns their own business, cooking international cuisine and selling it at different markets and events. I see a lot of students who have met success because they worked really, really hard and because they focused on the strengths and skills that they have. So they are my why. The students, our MLL students at our school, are my why and why I've decided to take this role, but also why I've decided to put on this professional learning session for you. So next, if I was presenting to a school or my school here in Anglophone South, I would present these demographics from New Brunswick just to get an idea of our current context. So our classroom composition is really changing drastically as the demographics of our school change and as we welcome new students. Even if your schools are not seeing large numbers of newcomers at this time, it will change in the coming years, and we need to be prepared to meet their needs as they arrive. Additionally, as our demographic rapidly changes, we're going to encounter many cultural differences, and the better we know ourselves, our own values and biases, the more prepared we are to work with students from a variety of cultural backgrounds as well. So I've added this graph to show the trends and growth here in Anglophone South over the last few years in comparison to that of other jurisdictions. And this quote, New Brunswick could welcome between 50,000 and 75,000 newcomers over the next 10 years. So as I said before, if schools are not seeing that demographic change yet, they will. I know my school already is, and so we need to be prepared to meet the needs of these students as they arrive. Next, we're going to look at CEFR, or Common European Framework of Reference, and what that exactly means. So the CEFR is a language continuum that goes from basic user to more proficient. It's important that we know what this is and what these levels mean so that when we're talking about multilingual learners and their abilities, that we all kind of are on the same page, that we understand what that means. It also helps us to frame what our students can do and what their strengths are versus having a deficit mindset of what they can't do. So it's really important that we're all on the same page about this. We're also going to circle back to this when we get to some student stories later in the presentation. And so it will help everyone understand what those students in those particular scenarios are capable of doing in terms of their language levels and academics. So if we look at this graph right here, we have A1 and A2. These are basic language users. So if you're an A1 student, you're working on just kind of survival phrases, very basic social language. A2 is obviously a little bit more advanced. So maybe some very basic personal and family information, but these would both be considered basic users. Next, we're going to move on to B1 and B2. These would be more independent users of the language. A lot of our students in high school fall in this category. So they might not be quite ready for academic language at this point, but they can start to understand main ideas of text and some abstract topics as well. When we get to C1 and C2, these are proficient users, students who are more prepared for academic language. So next we would now watch this video called From Far Away. This is an animated video, just a short video that shows the experience of a newcomer to a more Western kind of setting of school, and how there might be some cultural misunderstandings and maybe some misunderstandings because of language ability at this point, and how as educators we need to be patient and understand that those differences might happen instead of maybe reacting in a way that we maybe shouldn't. So we're going to watch this video, and I want you to think of a time where a newcomer student might have experienced something similar in our school. And then next, think about this question. How could we help a new student to our school? What are some things we could do to make them feel welcome? I know I've had lots of situations like this in the past where a student did something like, for example, answer a phone call in class in their first little while here in Canada, and I maybe reacted in a way where I was not so happy with that student, and in reality the student didn't know, and they were also actually in this case the primary translator for their family. They were the only person in their family that spoke any English at all, and it was a phone call from a doctor that they really needed to take. And so I think that we need to consider all of these things when we're working with students, especially newcomer students who are brand new to our building and might not understand all of those cultural differences that we have yet. Now we're going to get into 7 areas of reflection, and we're going to start first with number 1, personal history and values. And I've added this quote as well for us to reflect on. I have come to see white privilege as an invisible package of unearned assets that I can count on cashing in each day, but about which I was meant to remain oblivious. White privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, guides, passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, and blank checks. So we're going to look at some personal history self-reflection questions. I'm going to read through them, and then in groups, I would put teachers in groups, and they would either share their responses with their group members if they're comfortable. Some of these things might be a little more personal, so they wouldn't have to, but giving them that option to kind of reflect on the questions themselves and then pair with a partner to reflect together. So the questions are, how does my personal history and worldviews affect my teaching practices? What are some privileges and or oppressions that I experience because of who I am? How has my background either helped or got in the way of my own personal success? Reflect on your own personal beliefs about diversity and equity. Next, we're going to look at number 2, pedagogical beliefs and approaches. Teachers who are culturally relevant assume that an asymmetrical relationship exists between poor students of color and society. Thus, their vision of their work is one of preparing students to combat inequity by being highly competent and critically conscious. So these are questions for self-reflection on pedagogical beliefs and approaches. What is my general approach to teaching? Who does this approach best serve? Do I consider my diverse students when deciding how to teach? Are my students reflected in the resources I use? And how often do I reflect on my own teaching practices? Number 3, knowledge of diversity issues. Teachers who are well versed in multicultural issues in Canada are better positioned to respond positively to student diversity. Knowledge of diversity issues, self-reflection questions. How current am I with research on diversity? How can I learn to be more culturally responsive? What do I already know about the following groups in Canada? Knowledge of students. I was hoping for teachers who could understand my experiences, be patient, and highlight what was best in me. So these are our knowledge of students self-reflection questions. How well do I know my students? How many of my students are from diverse backgrounds? What languages do my students speak? How could I include these languages in our everyday class or lessons? Assumptions about learning. Learning derives from a basis of strength and capability, not weakness and failure. Assumptions about learning self-reflection questions. What are some assumptions I make about learning? Am I meeting the instructional needs of all the students in my classes? What are my expectations for my students? Do I consider the life experiences of all my students when I set these expectations? Number 6, assumptions about knowledge. Teachers have opportunities to adapt the knowledge they teach, thus making it more relevant to students' prior knowledge and worldviews. Assumptions about knowledge self-reflection questions. What do I think students should learn in Canadian schools? Who controls this knowledge? How inclusive is this knowledge? And how often do I question curricular materials? Beliefs about society. Educators should have a good understanding of their own perceptions of societal issues. So these are the beliefs about society self-reflection questions. What are my beliefs about how society functions? Who controls the power in society? How do I feel about this? Do I believe that equity and social justice are important issues in Canadian society? Who has the power to decide the content and direction of educational policies? How do I feel about this? How do education and society connect? So at this point in the professional learning session, the groups of teachers would have gone through the 7 different areas of self-reflection. We would have talked about some of the answers. I would have asked some of the groups if they felt comfortable to share some of their answers and reflections, or even just thoughts they had, things that stood out, ideas that they had from reflecting on these kinds of questions. And we would talk about how it's really important that as educators, we know where we stand, we know what we believe, we have reflected on those things, thought about our values and our own biases and the way that we do things so that we can better meet the needs of our students in front of us in our classrooms. Then we would move on to some more group work, but this time we would kind of reverse those roles of student and teacher. So in this activity, the teachers would almost take on the persona of some of these students, and I've recorded some student stories here. I would divide the stories up amongst the groups, have them focus on one student, and then there are some reflection questions after to kind of help put themselves in the shoes or in the experience of the students that are in these stories. So I'm going to go through and just briefly read the student stories, and then we'll move on to the reflection questions. Student A arrived in Canada from Sudan with his sister with limited education, pre-A 1.1 on the CEFR scale. Frequent behavior issues in class. They would cry and say he wanted to go back to his country with his mother. There was violence in the home that resulted in him being removed. Frequently reports of experiencing racism in and out of school. There are frequent suspensions from school, altercations with the police, and at one point was placed in foster care. They were released from foster care and living in a youth shelter. They are not improving academically because of lack of support and attendance during the time his housing was insecure. Student B. They arrived in Canada from the Ukraine with their brother and mother. They had previous years of schooling, never missed school, but did arrive at an A1.2 CEFR level. His father had to stay and fight in the war. At times they do not hear from him for days. The student worries about his father all the time. His father was able to come back for a visit briefly, but did have to go back and leave his family again. Student C. They arrived in Canada from Syria with minimal English skills, a 1.1 on the CEFR scale, in trouble in class frequently, argumentative, and defiant, skipping class and getting in trouble with friends, frequent suspensions from school, and they get in physical fights. They've gotten in a physical fight at a sporting event that resulted in some police intervention. Student D. They arrived in Canada without their father from Sudan. The student had missed several years of school and arrived at an A1.1 CEFR level. They were immediately targeted on the bus by students from a different cultural background. Altercations happening on the bus that resulted in the police being called and students suspended from school. There were losses of bus privileges for all, and the student reports he's experiencing racism on the bus. Student E. This student retells her story of fleeing Syria on foot with her family after 3 failed attempts. She describes walking in a straight line following someone they paid to help them escape. This man showed them where exactly to walk so landmines would not explode. These are things the student frequently thinks about still. She's been in Canada for 6 years now and is now at a B1.1 CEFR level, although she does struggle to get through all of her content classes at the high school level. Her father recently passed away and she is struggling in school. Student F. They arrived in Canada from Afghanistan. This student has been in school her whole life, but arrived here in Canada at an A1.1 CEFR level. She cries in class, explaining how her friends are stuck in Afghanistan and are no longer permitted to go to school. This student reports that she is working as hard as she can to learn English quickly, but is struggling to pass her classes. So I would give one of these students' stories to each group, and then I would have them read through these questions and the scenario together. So the role reversal questions are: how do you think this student is coping with everyday requirements of school in an unfamiliar culture? How do you think this student needs to adapt their identity to fit into the context of our school? Do you think the content this student is learning in the classroom reflects their home culture? How would you feel if you were this student? Would you be able to adapt as quickly as this student has to? How would you want your teachers to respond to the learning challenges you face in a new culture and language? So I think these questions are really, really important to reflect on. I know the students that I work with often are frustrated with how difficult school is here in Canada in a different language. And for some of them, this is not just their second, this could be their third, fourth, or fifth language that they're trying to learn. And high school content is really tough. So I often say to the students, like, what would happen if I went to school in Syria tomorrow, or if I went to school in Afghanistan tomorrow, or if I went to school in the Ukraine tomorrow? And they all kind of laugh because they know that I wouldn't be successful right away, because even though I've had lots more years of school than they have, language is really hard and learning languages is really difficult. So I try to reframe that for them, and I think it's really important that we reframe that for us as educators as well, kind of thinking from the perspective of our students. So I would then have the teachers record some of the answers to the questions. Maybe they get through a few of these, maybe they get through all of them. It just depends on the group. And then I would have them maybe even just choose one question to answer. I might get them to share their scenario or their student story, and then reflect and then give us some of the answers or an answer from the questions that they discussed together. So our self-assessment and goal setting would be the very last activity of the day. So I've taken this rubric from the intercultural competence assessment that we reviewed in class, and I would have them read through the different dimensions. So overview of competence, openness, knowledge, and adaptability, and then kind of look at those qualifiers for each level: basic, intermediate, or full, and try to place themselves just on this rubric somewhere. I wouldn't ask them necessarily to share this with anyone. It's more so for their own reference and as kind of a jumping point or a starting point for the next part where they're going to set a goal. So I would ask them first, read through the dimensions and level qualifiers to place yourself on the rubric of intercultural competency. And then I would ask them to set one intercultural competency goal for themselves going forward. I might also ask them to kind of just quickly write a sentence: this is my goal, and then this is how I'm going to try to reach that goal in the next even kind of school year or in first semester of next year, kind of give themselves a timeline. I would ask if people wanted to share, they could. I would, again, not necessarily ask everyone to share this because it could be a personal thing, but just to kind of leave them with an action that they're going to take going forward. Then at the very end, we're going to go over our key takeaways or things that we learned. So first, our why, kind of keeping that and remembering our why in the back of our mind all the time when things get stressful and work piles up and we're getting busy, in hopes that that might help us react less and understand a little bit more and be a little more patient when we get really, really busy and overwhelmed, as teachers are all the time. Next is self-reflection and the importance of self-reflection and how we need to reflect on our own biases and values first. And that's, again, not something that happens overnight. It's something that is a slow process and kind of a continuum that we're all on. Next is role reversal and just putting yourself in the shoes of the students. And in those moments where maybe we're feeling overwhelmed or frustrated, trying to go through those reflection questions again, or bringing ourselves back to that point of understanding what it might be like for that student. And then finally, goal setting and how important it is. Like this, again, won't happen overnight. It's a process, but if we choose one goal and work towards that, that's really where we all should be, is trying to get better and improve. And so then I would leave the professional learning session with this and leave, of course, time for questions or comments at the end.